In the hushed, velvet-draped cathedral of fine dining that was Aria, a single, unwritten commandment governed the staff. When Marcus Thorne's limousine whispered to the curb, you ceased to exist. You developed a sudden, acute interest in the polishing of silverware in the deepest recesses of the kitchen. You remembered a phantom stain on a tablecloth in the empty banquet hall. You became a ghost, a whisper, anything but a target for the billionaire whose volcanic temper had reduced seasoned sommeliers to tears and sent Michelin-starred chefs into therapy. For 7 years, this was the law of the land. But on a sweltering August night, as the New York City pavement shimmered with heat, a 22-year-old waitress, drowning in a sea of debt and armed only with the quiet resilience of a weed growing through concrete, decided the law was about to be broken. This is not a story about a young woman serving a steak. It's the story of the woman who looked a titan in the eye and refused to blink, and in doing so, began to unravel a lie that had been festering at the heart of the city for 50 years. Aria, a restaurant so exclusive its reservation line was a myth to all but the city's 1%, operated on a frequency of controlled perfection. The chime of Waterford crystal was a delicate symphony. The gleam of polished mahogany was a dark mirror reflecting success, and the low murmur of conversation was the sound of empires rising and falling over plates of seared foie gras. For the staff, that murmur could shatter into a shriek of primal fear with a single, coded message from the hostess. Tonight, the word came from a pale-faced young man named Simon, his voice a strained whisper into his headset. "Code black. Thorne is 5 minutes out." The effect was instantaneous. The restaurant's meticulously choreographed ballet devolved into a panicked scramble for cover. Javier, a waiter with 2 decades of experience who had once stared down a charging bull in his native Spain, suddenly found a pressing need to reorganize the entire wine cellar. Beatrice, a server known for her nerves of steel, clutched her head and feigned a blinding migraine, retreating to the dim staff lounge. The busboys moved with the frantic energy of mice scattering before a hawk, finding invisible crumbs to sweep in the farthest corners of the room. The manager, a man named Mr. Davies, whose perpetually anxious expression seemed etched onto his face, burst from his office, a sheen of sweat on his brow. His eyes, wide with panic, scanned the rapidly emptying dining floor. "Where is everyone? We need a body for table 7. His table." His desperate gaze flew past the cowering figures and landed on the one person, standing perfectly still, methodically aligning a row of dessert forks at her service station. Clara Mayhew. Clara had been at Aria for 6 months, a lifetime in the high-turnover world of fine dining. She was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and possessed a preternatural calm that her colleagues mistook for naivete. She had heard the legends of Marcus Thorne, of course. They were whispered in the locker room like horror stories, tales of waiters being fired for the crime of having a shadow that fell across his plate, of hostesses berated for an insufficiently deferential smile. Clara listened to these stories with a detached curiosity. To her, the histrionics of the wealthy were just another variable in a complex equation. A job was a contract. She provided impeccable service, and they provided the money she so desperately needed. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her pragmatism was born of a crushing necessity. Clara wasn't working at Aria for the thrill of serving celebrities. She was fighting a war on 2 fronts. By day, she was a history major on a scholarship, poring over dusty archives and forgotten texts. By night, she worked to keep her grandmother, Eleanor, in the best memory care facility she could find. Eleanor, the woman who had raised her, a brilliant librarian whose own mind was now a fading manuscript, was slowly being erased by Alzheimer's. The bills for Sunset Meadows were a relentless, rising tide, and Clara was swimming against it with all her might. Quitting or being fired was not an option. It was a death sentence for her grandmother's care. "Mayhew!" Mr. Davies barked, his voice a cocktail of command and desperation. "Table 7, it's Thorne." Javier, peeking from behind a rack of wine glasses, made a wild, throat-slitting gesture at her. Clara simply met her manager's panicked gaze, her own expression calm and unreadable. "Certainly, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice steady. She placed the final fork, its tines perfectly aligned with its brethren, took a slow, centering breath, and smoothed the front of her starched black apron. She wasn't a fool. She knew this was a trial by fire, but the fire she faced every month when the bill from Sunset Meadows arrived, the fire that threatened to consume her grandmother's last vestiges of comfort and dignity, was infinitely more terrifying than any ill-tempered billionaire. As she walked towards the hostess stand, the great bronze doors of the restaurant swung open, admitting a gust of humid city air and a palpable wave of cold dread. Marcus Thorne didn't enter a room. He invaded it. He was a man in his late 50s, built like a bulldog, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and then left out in a storm. He was dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed fused to his body, a dark armor of wealth and power. His eyes, small and buried in his fleshy face, were chips of obsidian that scanned the room with a predator's dismissive arrogance. They missed nothing and despised everything they saw. Trailing him was a younger man in a lesser suit, a lawyer or an assistant, his face a blank mask of practiced deference. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," Simon the host stammered, his voice cracking. Thorne didn't honor him with a glance. His gaze swept the opulent dining room, a sneer twisting his lips. "My table," he grunted, not a question, but a demand. "Of course, sir. This way," Simon squeaked, leading him to the prime corner booth. As Thorne passed, Clara felt the sheer force of his personality, a suffocating pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. She watched him slide into the booth, his movements brusque and impatient. He immediately snatched the perfectly folded linen napkin, inspected it for a flaw that wasn't there, and tossed it aside with a grunt of disgust. Mr. Davies shot Clara a final, desperate look that screamed, "Just survive. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist." Clara picked up a chilled bottle of Voss water and 2 menus. Her heart wasn't pounding with fear like her colleagues'. It was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a siege drum. She had faced down doctors delivering grim prognoses and facility administrators with ledgers instead of hearts. She had held her grandmother's hand through bouts of terrifying confusion, whispering stories of a past her grandmother no longer remembered. A rude, powerful man in a restaurant was just another problem to be managed, another variable in the equation. She squared her shoulders and began the long walk to table 7. The hurricane had made landfall, and she was walking calmly into its eye. Clara approached the table with a fluid, practiced grace, the chilled water bottle cool and solid in her hand. The ambient buzz of the restaurant seemed to fade, creating a bubble of charged silence around table 7. Marcus Thorne was already barking into his phone, his voice a low, gravelly weapon. "I don't care what the SEC filing says. Buy it. Bleed them dry and then buy the building they work in. I want them ruined." His companion sat ramrod straight, staring at his own hands, a man paid handsomely to be invisible. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice clear and composed, pitched at a level that was professional, not subservient. He didn't look up, just waved a dismissive hand. "Water. No lemon. No ice. And don't hover." Right away, Clara replied, her tone even. She moved with an economy of motion, opening the bottle with a deft twist. The soft sigh of escaping pressure was the only sound. As she poured the water into the first heavy crystal glass, she took in the details. The frayed cuff on his left sleeve, barely perceptible but there, a sign of a favorite suit, worn often. The way he tapped his thumb against his phone case, a repetitive, anxious rhythm that belied his aggressive words. This wasn't just a powerful man. This was a man under immense, self-inflicted pressure. She poured the second glass for his companion, who offered a fleeting, grateful glance. Clara placed the menus on the table. "My name is Clara, and I'll be your server this evening. Would you care to hear our specials, or would you like a moment?" This finally earned her his attention. He ended his call with a sharp jab of his thumb, and his obsidian eyes locked onto hers. The full force of his glare was unnerving, designed to intimidate, to make people shrink. He was expecting her to stammer, to look down, to apologize for her own existence. Clara did none of those things. She met his gaze with a look of polite, professional neutrality. Her training as a historian had taught her the value of quiet observation, of letting the subject reveal themselves through their own actions. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even surprise, crossed his features before being brutally suppressed. "I know what I want," he snapped. "This menu is stale, a testament to your chef's terminal lack of creativity." He shoved the menu he hadn't read back across the table. "The porterhouse, Pittsburgh rare, charred on the outside, cold on the inside. If it's even remotely warm in the center, I'll send it back and you'll be serving it to the pigeons outside. And bring me the 82 Lafitte. Don't try to upsell me, and don't let your sommelier get his greasy fingerprints on it." "An excellent choice, sir," Clara said, making a note on her pad. She turned to the other man. "And for you, sir?" The man looked nervously at Thorne. Thorne didn't even look at him. "He'll have the chicken. He's on a diet." He said it with a contempt that was almost casual in its cruelty. The man's face flushed slightly, but he just nodded. "The chicken will be fine. Thank you." "Very good. I'll place those orders immediately," Clara said. She was about to turn away when Thorne's voice, sharp as a whip crack, stopped her. "Wait." She turned back. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and pointed a thick finger at the small, sterling silver salt shaker on the table. "This salt shaker," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet growl. "It's tarnished, right there at the base. Are you all blind in this establishment, or just lazy?" Clara leaned in, her gaze following his finger. There, on the intricate filigree at the base, was a minuscule dark spot, no larger than a pinhead. It was the kind of flaw one would only find if they were actively hunting for one. Any other server would have fallen over themselves with apologies, whisking the offending object away, as if it were radioactive. Clara did not. She looked at the spot, then back at him, her expression thoughtful. "You have an excellent eye, sir," she said, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing a piece of art. "That's not tarnish, however. It's the maker's mark of the silversmith, Gorham, the anchor insignia. They used that particular mark on their sterling pieces from 1863 to the early 1890s. It's quite a beautiful antique." She offered a small, professional smile. "We can, of course, replace it with a newer one if you'd prefer, but I'm afraid it would lack the history." The silence that descended on the table was absolute. The younger man's eyes were wide, with a mixture of horror and awe. Mr. Davies, watching from his post near the kitchen, looked as though he might physically collapse. No one corrected Marcus Thorne. No one met his belligerence with a calm, well-researched fact. Thorne stared at her, his jaw working silently. He had set a simple trap, a test of subservience, and she hadn't just sidestepped it. She had turned it into a history lesson. He was searching her face for a sign of smugness, of defiance, but found only quiet confidence. He saw a server who had simply done her homework. Finally, he leaned back in the booth, the leather creaking in protest. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "Leave it," he grumbled, breaking eye contact and picking up his phone again. He had lost the opening salvo, and he knew it. Clara gave a small, polite nod. "As you wish," she said, and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured and calm. When she entered the kitchen, the dam of tension broke. Javier grabbed her by the arm, his face ashen. "Are you crazy, Clara? A history lesson? He's going to have you fired and blacklisted from every restaurant in this city." Chef Dubois, a notoriously temperamental artist in his own right, looked up from the order ticket. "For Thorne," he muttered. "Pittsburgh rare. Make it perfect. I don't want that barbarian in my kitchen tonight." He then looked at Clara, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. The silversmith's mark. Bien joué. Well played, little one. The remainder of the meal was a tightrope walk over a canyon. Clara performed her duties with the precision of a surgeon. His wine was decanted flawlessly. His steak was delivered, a perfect carbon crust giving way to a cool, deep red center. She anticipated his every need, refilling his water glass before it was empty, clearing plates the second he was finished, all without being intrusive. She was a silent, efficient presence at the edge of his vision. He, in turn, watched her. He was searching for a mistake, a single slip-up he could pounce on. A drop of wine on the tablecloth, a moment of hesitation, a fork placed a millimeter out of alignment. She gave him nothing. When the check came, she placed the leather folio on the table. He scribbled a signature without looking at it. As Clara cleared the final plates, she saw what he had left. On a bill totaling nearly $5,000, he had left no tip. Not a single cent. It was a calculated, final power play. A message to let her know that despite her composure, despite her knowledge, she was still just the help. And he was still in control. Javier, who had crept over to her station, saw the 0 on the tip line and groaned. "I told you, Clara, all that perfection for nothing. He's a monster." Clara looked at the signed slip. She felt a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. That was money for Eleanor's medication, money for the specialized care she needed. But then, she thought of the look on his face when she'd called him out on the salt shaker. It wasn't just anger. It was confusion. She had disrupted his world, a world where everyone was either a sycophant or a victim. She tucked the slip into her apron. It wasn't a defeat. It was data. It was a clue to the man behind the monster. She had survived. And as she watched Marcus Thorne heave himself out of the booth to leave, his eyes met hers across the dining room. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a cold, calculating curiosity. The battle was over. But Clara had the distinct feeling that the war was just beginning. The $0 tip was not an ending. It was an invitation. Marcus Thorne, a man who moved markets with a single phone call, had apparently developed a new, vexing hobby, tormenting Clara Mayhew. He began frequenting Aria with a predatory regularity, shifting from a monthly tyrant to a weekly fixture. Each time he would demand her section, his voice a low growl to the host. "Give me the historian, the one who knows the silver." Every dinner became a meticulously crafted ordeal, a new level in a cruel psychological game. He became an expert in her potential failures. One evening, He sent back a lobster bisque 3 times, claiming the temperature was off by a single degree each time. Clara, armed with a digital food thermometer, calmly verified the temperature in the kitchen before bringing out the 4th bowl, placing it on the table with a quiet, 175 degrees, sir, as per your request. He ate it in stony silence. Another night, he quizzed her on the geological composition of the soil in the Bordeaux region where his wine originated. Clara, who had started spending her afternoons in the library, researching not 18th century trade routes, but viticulture and haute cuisine, was ready. She spoke of the gravelly earth of the left bank and the clay limestone of the right bank until his eyes glazed over with reluctant astonishment. Her composure became a thing of legend among the staff. They watched the nightly spectacle from a safe distance, a Greek chorus of nervous whispers. Javier would catch her by her locker after her shifts, his face a mask of worry. "Clara, this is not normal," he'd plead. "You need to make a mistake. Spill some water on him. Let Davies move you. This man is not just mean, he's vindictive. I heard he bought a bakery just to shut it down because they were out of his favorite croissant one morning." "I can't, Javier," she'd reply, her voice weary as she massaged her aching feet. "I need the money. There are other restaurants, good ones. Not like this," she'd say quietly. The truth was, Thorne, for all his cruelty, was a magnet for the city's elite. The other tables in her section, filled with bankers and socialites eager to be near his power, tipped extravagantly. His presence, ironically, was keeping her afloat. His abuse was the price she paid to keep her grandmother safe. Mr. Davies, meanwhile, was aging in dog years. He'd pull Clara into his cramped office, wringing his hands. "Mayhew, for the love of God, just be wrong about something. If he says the sky is purple, agree with him. Our reputation is tied to his patronage." "I am never disrespectful, Mr. Davies," Clara would counter, her voice firm. "I am professional and I am accurate. I will not lie to a customer to soothe his ego. That is not good service." "It's not about service, it's about survival," Davies would hiss. But for Clara, it had become about more than that. It was about dignity. In her life outside Aurea's velvet walls, she was powerless against a disease, against an uncaring medical system, against a mountain of debt. In this strange, nightly duel with Marcus Thorne, she had agency. Her integrity was the one thing he couldn't buy or bully out of her. It was the last piece of high ground she would not surrender. One evening, another player entered the game. An elderly gentleman, dining alone, was seated at a small table in her section. He was impeccably dressed in an old-fashioned tweed jacket, his face a roadmap of dignified sorrow. He ordered simply, spoke softly, and watched the room with intelligent, weary eyes. Clara treated him with a gentle respect she gave to all her patrons, a warmth that was entirely absent in her interactions with Thorne. She noticed he always ordered the Dover sole and a glass of Sancerre, and he read a well-worn book of poetry between courses. His name was Arthur Pendleton. One Tuesday night, Thorne was in a particularly foul mood. He was dining with 2 nervous-looking investors, and his performance of power was at its peak. He'd complained that the ice in his water was too dense, and that the ambient music was harmonically unsophisticated. He was in the middle of a tirade about market volatility when he paused, his gaze fixing on Arthur Pendleton's table. A strange, unreadable expression crossed Thorne's face, a flicker of something dark and ancient. He watched Pendleton for a long moment before turning back to his guests, his mood even fouler than before. Clara logged the interaction. Another piece of data. The climax arrived on a rainy Thursday. The restaurant was buzzing, and Thorne was holding court. He had finished his main course and was gesturing expansively with his hands, a large, gaudy gold cufflink flashing on his wrist. It was an ugly piece, ostentatious and out of character with his usual severe style. Clara had noticed it because it was new. He'd never worn it before. As she approached to clear the plates, he suddenly stopped talking and looked down at his wrist with a theatrical gasp. "My cufflink," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He looked at his wrist, then at the floor. "It's gone." His two guests looked around uncertainly. Thorne's eyes, cold and hard, rose to meet Clara's. "It was a gift from my father, an irreplaceable heirloom," he said, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of nearby tables. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "And it was on my wrist not 5 minutes ago, before she came to the table." He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Clara. The entire restaurant fell silent. This was a new level of cruelty. He wasn't just criticizing her service. He was accusing her of theft. "You clumsy little thief," he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "You probably knocked it loose when you were grabbing the plates. Thought you could pocket it, did you? Sell it for a few miserable dollars?" Mr. Davies was already scurrying over, his face the color of ash. "Mr. Thorne, I am certain there has been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is that you hire criminals to serve your food," Thorne bellowed. "I want her fired. I want her purse searched. I want the police called. Now!" This was it. The end game. He had finally found a way to break her that had nothing to do with wine temperatures or historical trivia. He was going to ruin her. Not just her career, but her life. The accusation of theft would follow her forever. She thought of Eleanor, of Sunset Meadows, of the scholarship she could lose. A wave of cold, nauseating panic washed over her. But then, through the fear, the historian in her took over. The part of her that was trained to observe, to analyze, to find the pattern in the chaos. She had been studying Marcus Thorne for weeks. She knew his tells, his habits, his armor, and she knew this was a lie. "No," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the silence with the sharp authority of truth. "What did you say to me?" Thorne snarled. Clara ignored him and looked at Mr. Davies. "The police will not be necessary, Mr. Davies." She then turned her gaze back to Thorne, her eyes holding his. "Because the cufflink is in the left pocket of your waistcoat." Thorne froze, his blustering rage momentarily short-circuiting. "What nonsense are you talking about?" "For the past 6 weeks, I have observed you every time you dine here." "Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice steady and clear, addressing not just him, but the entire rapt audience of the dining room. "You have a tell. When you are trying to impress someone, or when you feel your position of authority is being challenged, you have a habit of reaching over with your right hand and fiddling with your left cufflink. You twist it, and then you slide it up and down your sleeve." She paused, letting the silence stretch. His two investors were staring at him, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "Tonight you've been doing it almost constantly," Clara continued. "Just before you accused me, as your guests were questioning your market projections, you did it again. But this time, you were more agitated than usual. You unlinked it completely. I saw you palm it. And when you are nervous, you have a secondary habit. You place small objects in your left waistcoat pocket. Your lighter, a mint, and tonight, a very large, very gaudy gold cufflink." She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. It was no longer a waitress against a billionaire. It was an accusation of fact against a man who lived by bluster and lies. The power in the room had fundamentally shifted. "You're insane," Thorne whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. His face had gone pale. "Check your pocket, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice softening just a fraction. Please, so we can all get on with our evening." Trapped, with every eye in the room on him, he had no choice. Slowly, his hand trembling with rage and humiliation, he reached into his waistcoat pocket. His fingers fumbled for a moment, and then, with a look of pure shock, he pulled out the flashing, ugly gold cufflink. A collective gasp swept through the restaurant. His guests stared at the cufflink in his hand, then at his face, their expressions hardening into masks of contempt. He hadn't just been cruel. He had been caught in a pathetic, transparent lie. Thorne stared at Clara, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost incandescent. He was beaten, publicly and thoroughly, not by a rival or a regulator, but by a 22-year-old waitress who had simply been paying attention. Without another word, he threw a wad of cash onto the table, grabbed his coat, and stormed out of the restaurant, his guests pointedly not following. The silence he left in his wake was shattered by a smattering of applause from a nearby table. Mr. Davies looked like he had seen a ghost. Javier was staring at her with his mouth agape, as if she had just grown wings. As the buzz of conversation slowly returned to the room, Arthur Pendleton, the quiet man from the corner table, rose and walked over to her. He had witnessed the entire exchange, his weary eyes missing nothing. "Young lady," he said, his voice a low, cultured rumble. "That was the most remarkable display of courage and observation I have ever witnessed." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." Clara looked down at the card. It simply read, Arthur Pendleton, and a phone number. She looked from the card to the kind, sad eyes of the man who had given it to her. She had a feeling that her war with Marcus Thorne wasn't over. It had just found a powerful new ally. The aftermath of Thorne's public humiliation was strangely quiet. He did not return to Aria. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the staff, who now treated Clara with a kind of mythic reverence. Mr. Davies gave her a clumsy, heartfelt apology and a permanent raise. For the first time in months, Clara could breathe, but Arthur Pendleton's card felt like a heavy, unanswered question in her pocket. A week later, she called the number. A polite, professional voice answered, and an hour later, Clara found herself in a taxi heading to an address in a quiet, tree-lined corner of the Upper West Side. It wasn't a gleaming corporate tower, but a stately pre-war apartment building. Arthur Pendleton opened the door himself. He was dressed not in tweed, but in a simple cardigan, and he led her into a large, sun-drenched library. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, not the decorative, unread kind, but a chaotic, beloved collection of history, poetry, and art. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a worn leather armchair. "Tea?" Clara, feeling out of her depth, simply nodded. He prepared the tea himself with the quiet efficiency of a man long used to his own company. He handed her a cup and sat opposite her. "I have not been able to stop thinking about what happened at the restaurant," he began, his voice gentle. "It wasn't just that you stood up to him. It was how you did it. You used observation as a weapon. You used his own character against him. Where did you learn to do that?" "My grandmother," Clara said, surprised by her own directness. "She has Alzheimer's. For the last few years, her words, they don't always match her reality. I had to learn to see what she was really feeling, to notice the small things, a tremor in her hand, a flicker of fear in her eyes. I had to learn to find the truth underneath the confusion." She paused, then added, "And I'm a history student. I'm trained to look for patterns, to connect details that don't seem related, to build a narrative from fragmented evidence. Pendleton nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his weary eyes. "The truth underneath the confusion," he repeated softly. "That is a perfect description of my life's work." He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Clara, what I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. Marcus Thorne is not just a bully. He is a fraud, and his entire empire is built on a theft that destroyed my family." He began to tell her a story, a piece of forgotten New York history. 50 years ago, his father, a brilliant but trusting inventor named George Pendleton, had founded a small manufacturing company with his best friend and partner, a charismatic salesman named Franklin Thorne, Marcus's father. George was the genius, Franklin the showman. They were poised for greatness. My father created a revolutionary new alloy, lightweight but stronger than steel. It was his life's work, Pendleton said, his voice thick with old pain. Franklin, who handled the business side, convinced my father to sign a series of complex patent and partnership agreements. My father trusted him completely. A week after the final papers were signed, there was a fire in the lab. All of my father's research notes were destroyed. A month later, Franklin Thorne used a loophole in the agreements to push my father out of his own company, taking the patent for the alloy with him. He claimed the invention was a joint effort, and my father's notes were irrelevant. The company, renamed Thorne Industries, became a titan. The alloy was used in everything from aerospace to construction. The Thornes became billionaires, while George Pendleton, betrayed and heartbroken, fell into obscurity and died a few years later, a broken man. I have spent 30 years and a small fortune trying to find proof, Arthur said, his voice laced with decades of frustration. Legal proof, a document, a letter, anything that shows Franklin's premeditated fraud. But he was meticulous. He erased every trace. Marcus inherited his father's company, his fortune, and his pathological need to crush anyone he perceives as a threat. He knows his legacy is built on a lie, and that fear makes him cruel. He looked at Clara, his gaze intense. The way you dismantled him, it was the first time I have seen anyone penetrate his armor. He builds his world on intimidation, and you refused to be intimidated. He relies on lies, and you countered with methodical, observable truth. He stood and walked to a large mahogany desk. He returned with a thin, leather-bound folder. He placed it on the table between them. "This is not an immediate offer of a job," he said, anticipating her thoughts. "That would be foolish for both of us. This is a proposition, a test. Inside this folder is everything my private investigators have gathered over the years. It's a dead end, a wall of failures. I want you to read it. I want you to apply your unique perspective. See if you can find the truth underneath the confusion." He named a sum for her time that made Clara's head spin. It was more than she made in 6 months at Aria. "If you find nothing, you will be well compensated for your efforts," he concluded. "But if you find something, if you can find a crack in that 50-year-old wall, then we can discuss a more permanent arrangement, a chance to help me reclaim my father's legacy and see justice done." The offer was overwhelming, terrifying, and exhilarating. It was a chance to use her skills, honed in libraries and at her grandmother's bedside, for something monumental. It was a path out of the constant, grinding worry that defined her life. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For the next 2 weeks, Clara lived inside that folder. The world of Aria, with its clinking glasses and hushed gossip, faded away. She took a leave of absence, telling Mr. Davies it was a family matter. Her small apartment became a war room, the walls covered in timelines, corporate family trees, and photographs of the key players. The investigators' reports were thorough but lifeless. They had followed the money, interviewed disgruntled former employees, and hit the same brick walls. Franklin Thorne had been a master at covering his tracks. Clara took a different approach. She wasn't looking for a financial smoking gun. She was looking for the men themselves. She read old society pages, interviews, and company newsletters from the era. She tried to understand who George Pendleton and Franklin Thorne were. George was an introvert, a man of science who was photographed squinting in the sunlight. Franklin was always smiling, a hand on someone's shoulder, a master of the public image. Then she found it, a small, overlooked detail in an interview with Franklin Thorne from 1973, just after he had solidified his control of the company. The interviewer asked him about his hobbies. Thorne had laughed and said, "I'm a terrible golfer and an even worse fisherman. My only real talent outside the boardroom is my penmanship. George used to say I could have been a professional forger." It was a throwaway line, an arrogant boast, but it snagged in Clara's mind. A forger. She cross-referenced it with a detail from one of the investigators' reports, a brief mention that the final, crucial partnership document, the one that gave Thorne control, was the only major contract not typed, but handwritten, supposedly because the company's new typewriter had broken that day. The investigator had dismissed it as a curious anomaly. Clara saw it as a potential stage. Her heart pounding, she dug deeper. She needed a sample of her father's. The call to Arthur Pendleton was not a cry of victory. It was a death knell, sounded across 50 years of silence. When Clara explained what she had found, not a complex financial discrepancy, but a simple human lie captured in ink. The line went quiet. She could hear the old man breathing, a ragged, unsteady sound, as if the air in his own lungs had suddenly become a foreign substance. He wasn't celebrating. He was grieving. He was mourning the life his father might have had, a life stolen by the flourish of a well-practiced pen. "I think I found it," she had said, her voice a tremor of adrenaline and awe. "It's not in the numbers. It's in the ink." What followed was not a cinematic montage of high-stakes infiltration, but a slow, grinding war of attrition fought by men in quiet, wood-panelled offices. Arthur, awakened from a lifetime of weary resignation, moved with the terrifying precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. He assembled a legal team that operated with the silence and lethality of a submarine. The world's foremost forensic document examiner, a woman from The Hague with eyes that could see the ghosts of molecules, was flown in. The original contract was subpoenaed from the Thorne Industries archives under the guise of a routine audit, a legal maneuver so subtle that Marcus Thorne's corporate sentinels barely registered it. The examiner's report, when it came, was a masterpiece of scientific poetry. It spoke of microscopic fiber disturbances, of inconsistencies in ink aging under spectrographic analysis, of the subtle hesitation in the downstroke of the P in Pendleton, the microscopic pause of a forger's hand, a psychological stutter invisible to the naked eye. It was irrefutable. It was a declaration of war. But Arthur knew, and Clara learned, that truth is not a weapon that fires itself. Marcus Thorne's empire was a fortress, and his lawyers were its Praetorian guard. They would drown this truth in a sea of motions, appeals, and delays, bleeding Arthur's resources dry until the 50-year-old crime felt like ancient history, irrelevant and unprovable to a jaded world. "We cannot fight him in the courts alone." "Not at first," Arthur said one evening, the two of them cloistered in his library, the examiner's report lying between them like an unexploded bomb. To fight a beast like Thorn, you cannot simply cage him. You must first convince him the jungle is on fire and his fortress is made of straw. And so, Clara's role shifted. She was no longer just the catalyst. She became the strategist. She put aside the legal documents and returned to her primary source, the man himself. She spent her days in the archives of the New York Public Library, but she was not reading corporate histories. She was reading society pages from the last 30 years, poring over interviews, charity gala photos, transcripts of off-the-cuff remarks. She was mapping the intricate architecture of Marcus Thorne's ego. She discovered his vulnerabilities were not financial, but psychological. He had an obsessive need to be seen as a legitimate heir, a worthy successor to his father's brutal genius. He was pathologically terrified of being perceived as weak or foolish. He surrounded himself not with loyalists, but with sycophants who mirrored his own manufactured strength back at him. He trusts no one, but he relies on the perception of loyalty, Clara explained to Arthur's lead counsel, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Evelyn Reed. His power is a performance. If the audience begins to doubt the actor, the play is over. Their strategy became one of psychological warfare. It began with a single, anonymous leak to a respected financial journalist, not about the forgery, but about a minor, previously undisclosed regulatory issue from the 1980s. It was a nothing burger, legally, but it was the first stone cast into the placid pond of Thorne's public image. Then came another, a whisper about a risky, over-leveraged real estate deal he was pursuing. Thorne, predictably, reacted with volcanic fury, issuing scathing public denials that only drew more attention to the stories. He was fighting shadows, wasting his energy on phantoms they had conjured. Clara's insight was their targeting system. He will meet with his CFO on Tuesday morning to contain the fallout from the leak, she would predict, having cross-referenced his calendar from a past lawsuit's discovery files with his known behavioral patterns. That is when you serve the subpoena for the CFO's personal emails. It will make Thorne think his inner circle is compromised. They never attacked the fortress head-on. They poisoned the well. They sowed discord among his lieutenants. They used Thorne's own paranoia as their primary weapon, turning his mind into a prison. Clara watched from a distance as news reports chronicled his increasingly erratic behavior. He fired long-time executives. He lashed out at reporters. The carefully constructed mask of the indomitable Titan was cracking, revealing the terrified, insecure man beneath. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, formal summons. Marcus Thorne was not dragged into a courtroom. He was invited to a meeting at Evelyn Reed's law firm, a neutral ground of grey carpets and muted abstract art. The final, fatal blow. Clara was there. Arthur had insisted. She did not wear a waitress's uniform, but a simple, dark grey dress that felt like armor. She sat not at the main table, but in a chair against the wall, beside Arthur. She was an observer, a historian, watching the final chapter write itself. When Marcus Thorne entered the room, he was a man hollowed out from the inside. The blustering rage was gone, replaced by a grey, exhausted pallor. He had lost 20 pounds, and his expensive suit hung on him like a shroud. His eyes, those once terrible chips of obsidian, were dull and bloodshot. He scanned the room, his gaze passing over the lawyers, over Arthur, and then it landed on Clara. For a single, silent moment, the universe contracted to the space between them. He saw her. He truly saw her for the first time. The historian. The one who knew the silver. The quiet, insignificant girl who had pulled the single thread that unraveled everything. In his eyes, she did not see hatred. She saw a terrifying, profound confusion, the look of a man who has discovered the laws of physics have suddenly ceased to apply. He had built his world on the principle that power always wins, that money is gravity, and she, with nothing, had proven him wrong. He looked away, a shudder passing through his heavy frame. He was broken. The meeting was brief and brutal. Evelyn Reed did not speak of fraud or forgery. She spoke of legacy. She laid out, with surgical precision, the narrative they would release to the world, a story of historical discrepancies, of restoring a founding partner's rightful legacy. It was a quiet, dignified execution. There would be no prison, no public humiliation, but there would be a complete and total surrender. Thorne did not speak. He sat, staring at the polished surface of the conference table as his lawyers murmured their assent. He signed the sheaf of documents with a pen that looked like a child's toy in his trembling hand. He signed away a controlling interest in the company. He signed away his father's name from the corporate letterhead. He signed away the lie that had been the foundation of his entire life. When it was over, he stood, and without looking at anyone, he walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound of a tomb being sealed. In the silence that followed, Arthur Pendleton reached over and placed his frail, trembling hand over Clara's. "It is done," he whispered. His voice was not triumphant. It was the voice of a man laying a ghost to rest. Clara did not feel the elation she had expected. She felt a profound, aching emptiness. She had studied the fall of empires in her textbooks, but she had never understood the quiet, pathetic reality of it. It was not a grand spectacle. It was just a tired, broken man signing his name on a piece of paper. That evening, Clara didn't go home. She walked. She walked for hours through the canyons of the city, the setting sun glinting off the glass and steel towers that Thorne's alloy had helped build. The city felt different, as if she was seeing it in a new spectrum of light. She had always felt like a ghost, haunting its edges, a powerless observer. Now, she was a part of its hidden history, a secret architect of its present. The power of it was a dizzying weight. She had wielded truth like a weapon, and in doing so had obliterated a man's world. Did justice feel like this? So quiet, so complicated, so sad? She ended up at Sunset Meadows. Her grandmother was in the garden, sitting in a wheelchair, her gaze fixed on a rosebush, her expression placid and distant. Clara knelt beside her, taking the familiar, paper-thin hand in hers. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly. Eleanor turned her head, and for a moment a flicker of recognition sparked in her pale blue eyes. "Clara, my dear. You look tired." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I am. It's been a long day." She sat there, holding her grandmother's hand, the silence a comfortable blanket. She didn't tell her the fairy tale of the evil king and the brave waitress. The story felt too simple now, too childish. The world was not made of heroes and villains. It was made of flawed, frightened people, of fathers and sons, of legacies of pride and shame. Marcus Thorne was not a monster from a storybook. He was the damaged inheritor of a poison he hadn't created, but had willingly consumed. "There was a man," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper, speaking more to herself than to Eleanor. He lived in a house built by his father. But the foundation was cracked from the very beginning, and he spent his whole life shouting at everyone, trying to make the walls seem strong because he was so terrified they would fall. And today, they fell. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently, her gaze drifting back to the roses. "Poor man," she murmured, her mind already moving on. "Did you bring me a book?" Clara smiled through her tears. In her grandmother's simple, disconnected empathy, she found a strange sort of peace. Miles away, in a penthouse apartment now owned by a bank, Marcus Thorne stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he no longer ruled. The rooms behind him were vast and empty, the art and furniture already removed by liquidators. All that remained was a single leather armchair and a small table. On the table was a silver-framed photograph of a smiling, charismatic man with cold eyes. His father, Franklin. He had spent his life trying to be that man. Stronger, more ruthless, more successful. He had lived in constant, screaming fear of being found unworthy, of failing to protect the stolen kingdom his father had bequeathed him. The cruelty, the rage, the bullying, it had all been armor. It was the performance of a king, played by a terrified imposter. And the waitress had seen it. She hadn't seen the king. She had seen the imposter, and she had said his true name out loud. He picked up the photograph, his thumb stroking the cold glass over his father's smiling face. He had not protected the legacy. He had lost it. He was a failure. The thought brought no anger, no rage, only a vast, desolate calm. The performance was finally over. There was nothing left to protect. He was, for the first time in his life, free, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. A week later, Clara was back in Arthur Pendleton's library. The room was unchanged, but the atmosphere was different. The heavy air of obsession had lifted, replaced by a quiet, contemplative peace. A new portrait hung over the fireplace, a handsome, bright-eyed man with a slide rule in his pocket. George Pendleton had come home. "He can finally rest," Arthur said, following her gaze. He turned to her, his eyes clear and filled with a profound gratitude that was almost painful to witness. A trust had been established that would care for her and her grandmother for the rest of their lives. The war was over. The spoils had been divided. But Arthur had one last offer. "When my father's work was stolen, it wasn't just a patent that was lost," he said, his voice low and steady. It was the future he wanted to build with it. A future of integrity, of innovation for the common good. Thorne Industries built skyscrapers and weapons. My father wanted to build bridges and hospitals. He gestured around the library, at the shelves groaning with the weight of history. This room is full of stories like ours, injustices buried in archives, truths hidden in the footnotes. The world is full of cracked foundations. He stopped before her. "I am restructuring the company. It will be renamed the Pendleton Group, and its heart will not be a boardroom, but a foundation, a department of lost causes. Its mission will be to use our resources to investigate and correct historical injustices, to fund the kind of work you did for me, to find the truth underneath the confusion." He looked at her, and Clara saw he wasn't offering her a job as a reward. He was asking for her help. He was an old man who had completed his life's work. He was looking for a successor. "The foundation needs a director," he said. "It needs someone with a historian's patience and a warrior's heart. Someone who understands that the most important stories are often the ones no one is telling." Clara thought of the cold satisfaction of discovery, the quiet horror of victory, the complex weight of justice. She thought of her grandmother's fading mind and the truths hidden in the flicker of an eye. She thought of Marcus Thorne, not as a king, but as a frightened man in a falling house. Her battle hadn't just toppled an empire, it had taught her the true nature of power, truth, and the fragile human stories that lie beneath the grand, cold sweep of history. It wasn't just something you read in a book, it was something you had a responsibility to. She met the old man's gaze, her own clear and steady. The fear was gone, the uncertainty was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable purpose. I would be honored, Clara Mayhew said.